Hi, welcome to the Libertarian Alternative. My name is Mark Selzer, and the Libertarian Alternative is an educational television show brought to your community by the Libertarian Party. Today we'll be talking about the war on terror. Now, libertarians are opposed to the invasion of Iraq. We're opposed to, traditionally, in our 30-year history, all wars, because war is the health of the state, and we are very skeptical of government growth and the government's ability to tax us to pay for it. So, but we do have a problem, obviously, because of 9/11, with terrorists attacking the United States. So I have on today a military strategist who is also a libertarian to talk today on what we should be doing to fight the war on terror in a more responsible fashion. Thanks for coming out today, Joe.
Hi.
And you're Joseph Miranda, and you are you used to be in the U.S. Armed Forces.
Yes, I was a former officer in the U.S. Army. I was an instructor at the John F. Kennedy Special Warfare Center at Fort Bragg. And among the other topics I taught was counterterrorism.
Aha.
And more currently, I'm the editor of Strategy and Tactics magazine. And actually, I design military-style simulations for a living, in part.
Okay, so you've continued with doing military strategy, and you write
Yes.
for a magazine for people that are entertained by looking at this kind of thing.
Yes.
So you've continued on with it. So you were, how long were you in the?
I was in the U.S. Army for a total of 6 years.
6 years, okay.
Plus some time in the reserves.
Okay. Now, after 9/11, we seem to have, I thought we've been going one blunder after another, because I think that what we're doing here is we're kind of blaming the group rather than blaming the individual responsible. I mean, Muslims, there's a huge number of people on the earth. 1/3 or 1/4 of the world population are Muslims, and we seem to be putting them into a group. I've always thought that this war, the attacking Iraq, is kind of the mentality of, if some people from a Muslim part of town robbed a bank, we would go over and then start bombing their neighborhood in order to teach them a lesson, you know, those Muslims a lesson. But as libertarians, we want to always treat people as individuals and stay away from group thinking.
Well, look at the problem here. Okay, in the years since 9/11, even though we're told we have a war on terror, we're not identifying who exactly we're fighting. It's just like there's some sort of amorphous group called the terrorist out there. And when you read accounts, at least in the popular media, there's no real definition of who exactly the enemy is. Now, I mean, I compare this to the Cold War, where at least the government could say, well, we're against the Russian army, or Vietnam, we're against the Viet Cong infrastructure. But today, there's no such definition. And it just seems to be that the phrase the terrorist is being used to give the government a blank check to do anything. And needless to say, this leads to a lot of wrong-headed policies.
Right, and we're bombing civilian areas in Iraq, which is not even the country that the terrorists came from. The terrorists came from Saudi Arabia.
Right. Well, if you look at it, the Osama bin Laden organization has been around for ever since the closeout of the Afghan war, war against the Soviets, and it's actually consists of a series of networks of different political, insurgent, economic groups, and they've operated throughout much of the world. Now, often these groups are against the very governments that we claim to be are the problem here.
Enemies.
Right. For example, in Iraq, well, they condemned Saddam Hussein for being a secularist and a socialist and all this other stuff. So you have to make a distinction here. And many of these organizations that support him are constantly changing in their organizational structure. For example, they use basically what we would call a network form of organization. Instead of like the way it was in the good old days, where you have somebody at the top and you have cadres beneath them and then an infrastructure, you have a series of different organizations there which have come together, which have formed, which have dissolved. So you have, for example, various insurgent organizations, you have financial networks, and so forth and so on. Now, if we are in war with the Al-Qaeda organization, and by the way, the term Al-Qaeda wasn't always used for Osama's organization. Okay, he had a number of different organizations going back to the 1980s when he was fighting against the Soviet Union.
When we were supporting him.
Yes, when we were supporting him.
Supporting him financially.
Right. And so the problem is that first and foremost, these organizations should be identified and then appropriate action should be taken. The problem is, at least publicly, there doesn't seem to be an attempt to do this. And what you have is a bunch of haphazard operations. It's like, for example, to get on an airplane these days, it's like, well, basically it's like checking into county jail.
You're right.
You know, and you're right. And nobody sits down and says, well, are these operations really necessary? Is it necessary to make getting onto an airplane so difficult? Instead, it's just, well, somebody attacked using an airplane once, they're going to be using the same tactics again. Well, actually, that turns things upside down. Usually, in this kind of warfare, this kind of unconventional warfare, they'll attack in one way once, and then they won't do it again.
Right.
So effectively, they got our attention fixed on a form of counterterrorism that really, for the most part, probably isn't needed.
Right. And people want to feel safe. I don't know how much safer I feel when they're taking my nail clippers away from me, you know, and now your Bic lighter or something like that, which is actually okay, because once I was, you know, I don't know whether I'm being irresponsible by, you know, saying this, but I take rubbing alcohol, which is flammable, with me when I travel, because when I shave, I have to put it on afterwards, otherwise it's uncomfortable for me and I'll break out. And I take it on me on the plane with me. It's usually in my carry-on luggage, because oftentimes I have to shave before I arrive and stuff like that. And you know, I thought, you know, well, this rubbing alcohol, this is flammable. You know, I could pour this under the cabin and, you know, set it on fire, and then the plane would crash. I'm just thinking, well, you know, they took my tweezers, they took away my nail clippers, and they left me with this, you know, this flammable liquid. And I guess they can't take away everything, but it's just basically now the people on the airplanes know that if someone's going to hijack the plane, you know, immediately everyone in the plane should attack that person. And not because, you know, they're going to try to crash the plane, or they may try to crash the plane.
The situation's changed from the kind of hijackings you had back in the 60s and 70s, where the terrorist, I should say, in quotation marks, their objective was to get out alive. Today, the big change is that more and more terrorism involves people who want to effectively commit suicide.
Martyrdom.
Right. So it's a difficult situation often, because in the old days you could often outweight them and they would surrender or go away. Today, time is on their side.
All right.
And this represents a real break in operations. Now, if you go back to the 60s and 70s, you had a lot of terrorism. You had groups within the United States and radical groups within the United States and Western European countries were doing things like bombings and kidnappings, and you had the various hijackings in the Middle East. But at first this was effective because it was a new form of warfare, and also because I think people psychologically were on the defensive owing to the mass protests against Vietnam and other things. But the counterinsurgent forces figured it out very quickly how to deal with this. They did three things, essentially. The first was to share intelligence about the terrorist networks. Okay. The second thing was to ramp up routine security, but not make life difficult. So you put a couple of air marshals on an airplane. That kind of solved the problem. You didn't turn getting into an airplane into a Kafkaesque exercise. And the third thing they did was to organize special anti-terrorist units like Delta Force or the Israeli commandos who took out the terrorists at Entebbe. And that way you could effectively deal with the problem without disrupting